Some of the most important moments in our lives rely on the judgment of others. A doctor diagnosing your illness, a judge deciding the harshness of your sentence, or a hiring committee deciding whether you should get that new job. We like to believe these judgments are made fairly and correctly.
Our system should be fair to people. They shouldn't treat them as beneficiaries of good or bad luck just by virtue of the decision maker. If the decision maker's in a good mood, maybe you get promoted. If the decision maker's in a terrible mood, maybe you don't. That's really unfair.
We all know that human judgment can be flawed, and we're all familiar with the biggest culprit that causes error in judgment: bias.
Bias is obviously bad. If it's racial bias or bias on the basis of sex discriminatory bias, that's self-evidently bad.
But there's another error-causing offender that most people have never heard of. It's called noise.
Noise is a more invisible enemy, and noise is a statistical concept, not a causal concept. So bias is causal. For noise, you don't know what the cause is.
This is Cass Sunstein. He's a hometown hero here at the University of Chicago, having served in the law school for 27 years. Now he's a professor at Harvard Law School, senior counselor at the Department of Homeland Security in the Biden administration, and one of 3 co-authors of a new book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment.
The kind of punchline of the book is wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and more than you think.
Noise is a little understood concept.
The human mind doesn't get all excited at noise, and one of the goals of the book is to get the human mind more excited about noise as a whole.
Noise is around us all the time, appearing in medical misdiagnoses, when people get higher sentences than they may deserve or others receive for the same crime, or when the wrong people are hired for crucial jobs.
In many organizations, once you have some kind of audit of noise, it's scandalous, and people say there ought to be a law.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, this is Big Brains, a podcast about the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Today, noise. I'm your host, Paul Rand. Noise is a tricky concept, but once you understand it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. The best place to start is the difference between noise and bias.
So if you have a scale that every morning says you're 5 pounds heavier than you know you actually are, that is a bias scale. If you have a government official who thinks that because we haven't had a pandemic in the United States in a long time, this is not going to be a pandemic, when in fact the objective analysis suggests that it is, then we have a biased official.
When we are consistently prejudiced, one way or another, for or against something or someone, that's bias. And consistency is really the key.
A systematic tendency to err in a specific direction compared to the accurate value.
If bias is consistent error, noise is the opposite. It's scattered and random, much like the noise you hear all around you. In all that seeming randomness, it can be hard to pinpoint exactly what's causing the problem. Unlike bias, which can often be pinned down, noise is all the invisible stuff that's affecting decisions that we can't see. If you removed bias completely from a set of judgments and still saw variation, what you're left with is noise.
So you can think of it, if people are in a shooting range, and if everyone shoots at the target accurately, there's no noise and there's no bias. If everyone shoots at the target to the right, exactly the same point, then there's bias but no noise. If everyone shoots in a random way all over the target, then it's noisy but not biased. And that shooting range example maps on to a lot of organizations.
And bias is something we all kind of think we understand and recognize the concept of and work with on a regular basis.
Now, bias has a kind of charisma. It's a little like the person on the screen whom you can't take your eyes off of, Elvis Presley in the early days.
You ain't nothing but...
Noise is more like the character in a murder mystery to whom you never pay attention, but who turns out to be the killer. If you see the human mind as a measuring instrument, the human mind is noisy and is often a killer, sometimes literally a killer, as in hospitals.
So, how does this killer operate? What does noise look like? The easiest place to see it is in the criminal justice system.
If you have judges, let's start with judges, and some are just really tough on criminals and others aren't. You can have a noise in the system where some judges are going to say, let's say with drug offenders, I'm going to give the maximum sentence, and others are going to say, I'm going to give the minimum sentence. That will create a noisy system in which criminal defendants are subject to a lottery depending on whom they draw as their particular judge.
One study from 1981 found that 200 judges given the same 16 hypothetical cases only unanimously agreed on a prison term in 3 of the 16 cases. In one case, terms ranged from a mean of 8.5 years to life in prison. That's a life-altering difference just based on the luck of the draw of the judge that you get.
And you could see this in grants of asylum, where some people will be really tough, some people not so much. You could see it in grading in universities, where one professor might be, very reluctant to give an A, and another might be very happy to give an A, and that could create noise across the system.
Another study of asylum seekers found that one judge admitted only 5% of applicants, while another admitted 88%. That's a huge difference. That's noise in the system. But there can also be noise within a single individual.
So if you are really happy, say because the Chicago Bears won and you really care about them, or the Chicago White Sox, then you might make a judgment which is more lenient or more kind with respect to, let's say, a criminal defendant or a job applicant than you would otherwise make. We actually have data with respect to sports teams and weather that suggests judgment can be affected by success of sports teams and by weather, and that can produce noise within the person and so noise within the system.
It sounds absurd, but it's true. One study of 1.5 million judicial decisions found that judges were harsher in the days following the loss of a local football team. Another review of 200,000 immigration court decisions found that people are less likely to get asylum when it's hot outside. These big moments in people's lives shouldn't come down to the temperature.
There are 2 reasons why noise is bad. The first is unfairness, and arbitrariness sometimes refers to invidious prejudice, but it often refers to like being struck by lightning. And our system should be fair to people. They shouldn't treat them as beneficiaries of good or bad luck just by virtue of the decision maker. So that's the first reason. The second is about cost. If you have a bunch of doctors in a hospital who are very optimistic about the patient's prospects and therefore tell them to go home, and a bunch who are very pessimistic and then order a zillion tests, those mistakes add up. And that could cause very serious health problems where the people who go home might get sick and die, and the people who are tested might spend a lot of money, and too many tests can cause health problems. We think of medicine rightly as something which has expertise and specialization. So the idea that in diagnosing endometriosis or lung cancer or heart disease, doctors would be very noisy, that was not expected by me. So it just is the case that in medicine, the idea of getting a second opinion is often a really good idea because the second opinion isn't going to be the same as the first. And that is alarming. Now, we don't want to be too hard on doctors. The level of noise isn't, out of control, except in psychiatry where it really is, but it's much higher than one would think. And as many hospitals know, that's a problem because if 2 doctors disagree, maybe because one is biased in one or another way, one of them has to be wrong. And what are we going to do about that?
So what are we going to do about it? It's clear that this level of unfairness is dangerous and maybe even deadly. Solutions for cutting through the noise are after the break. Thank you for listening to Big Brains. If you're enjoying our podcast, please take a minute to give us a review and a rating. And tell a friend about the show too. We hope to share these conversations about pioneering research with as many people as possible. Again, thanks for listening. So, if we now kind of get our arms around what noise is, you also talk about some solutions for it and recognizing that there are some inherent problems that people can recognize bias and maybe work against it, but noise is something that's really hard to recognize. And one of the concepts I actually thought was kind of interesting, you called it decision hygiene. And I wonder if you can tell me what that means.
The idea of decision hygiene is designed to suggest that when you wash your hands or engage in hygienic practices, you're counteracting an enemy that you can't identify. And the idea of decision hygiene is there are things you can do that can reduce noise and maybe even eliminate it, even if you don't know what's responsible for it.
You also spent some time talking about different remedies, and one of the other ones, which I thought was interesting and maybe cumbersome in some of these groups, is the wisdom of crowds. So we're probably not going to get a crowd of judges to weigh in on something, but tell us what you mean about wisdom of crowds and how that fits into this.
Okay, so if you get a group of 20 people to decide something, chances are that another group of 20 similar people is going to make the same decision. Maybe I could give an example from jury behavior, where we actually have data which will make the point clear.
Sure.
We find that individual judgments about the dollar amounts people should pay for misconduct are really noisy, crazy noisy. But if you aggregate groups into groups of 6 or 12, they will be much less noisy. If you take the average of a group of 6, or even better, an average of a group of 12, that will be a pretty good predictor of what another group of 12 is going to do, whereas what an individual is going to do is a terrible predictor of what another individual is going to do. And if this seems a little abstract, when hospitals ask 4 doctors or 6 doctors to make a decision and they take, let's say, the average view or the majority view, that is likely to cut both bias and noise, which is why aggregating independent judgments with independence in huge font and in bold letters, that is a great noise buster.
One of the other things you also was kind of interesting is you talked about something you called the cascade effect. And I wonder if you can play that into this whole concept that we were just talking about.
Great. It's an important qualification of what I just said, and gives some clarity. So let's talk about a study done a number of years ago of the popularity of songs.
Okay.
So there was a website that had lots of bands and lots of songs. Some of them had eerily perfect titles for our book. I think one is actually called I Am Error.
Okay.
In the control group, you could get a sense of what songs people liked. But the experimental groups, the treatment groups, were ones in which people could see which songs had popularity within their particular group.
Okay.
The prediction of, let's say, the meritocrats is the best songs will ultimately be regarded as such and the worst as such, but that's not what happened. What happened was that while the best songs never completely crashed and the worst songs never went right to the top, other than that, anything could happen. So I Am Error could be, really popular, like a terrific success in one world if it got early downloads, and it could be really unpopular in another group where it didn't get early downloads. And the coolness of the paper is to show that because of social influences, groups can go in very unpredictable directions, depending on what is early on seen as liked by group members. And it fits with how groups sometimes work if people aren't making independent judgments. So if you have a group of people in which, let's say, the first 2 members say, let's open an office in Singapore with great confidence and enthusiasm, And the third, who let's say has her private doubts, think, well, I have my private doubts, but the first two think it's great, so I guess I'll say so too. And then the fourth thinks, I have a lot of private doubts, but the first three said so, so I'm going to say, sure, sounds like a good idea. And that group opens the office in Singapore. You could have another group that's basically identical, where the first two speakers happen to be persons 3 and 4 in the group I just described. And they say, I don't think it's a good idea. And then the first two speakers in the first group are in the second group, the third and fourth speakers, and they say, I guess it's not a good idea. And that means that you can see a lot of noise across groups because of social influences and who speaks first and with the most enthusiasm and authority.
Okay, so that's the wisdom of crowds.
A second form of decision hygiene is guidelines.
Okay, and one of the examples used in the book was the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. And that seemed to really lay out this problem pretty starkly. Can you explain that case?
Yes. So one of our goals in the book is to get someone to erect a statue to Judge Marvin Frankel. He's kind of the hero of the book.
Cass and his co-authors are trying to bring noise back to the forefront, but this problem was identified years ago. In the 1970s, Judge Frankel discovered the rampant noise in the criminal justice system.
And he thought, this is scandalous. The idea that your life is on the line and it's random. It's like being struck by lightning, whether you get leniency or stringency. He said, that's horrible.
He started to argue for clear, concise guidelines as a solution, and his ideas came to the attention of the Supreme Court.
So he helped spur the enactment of the sentencing guidelines, which were intended to reduce unfair disparities among different judges by having guidelines which sharply constrained sentencing.
In 1984, the Sentencing Reform Act created mandatory guidelines to restrict the range of criminal sentences.
They didn't eliminate judgment, but they greatly narrowed it. And as a result of the sentencing guidelines, the range of variation across judges did get cut very dramatically.
The expected difference in sentence lengths dropped by 6%. But
a lot of judges hated that. They hated it because they thought, who do these members of Congress and these people on the commission, the Sentencing Commission, think they are? I'm a judge. I see the offender. I see the offense. Let me exercise discretion. I can tell what people deserve more accurately than some guidelines that were issued without any reference to the particular case I'm judging.
In 2005, the Supreme Court changed the guidelines from mandatory to just advisory.
And the result of the Supreme Court converting the guidelines from mandatory advisory was to result in a big burst of noise, like an explosion, a volume of noise in our sense, where variability broke out dramatically after the guidelines became advisory.
One study found that when guidelines were mandatory, harsh judges gave sentences almost 3 months longer than others. When they switched to advisory, that number doubled. It also increased bias as well. The disparity between sentences for African Americans and whites convicted of the same crime increased significantly. When it comes to judgment, it feels counterintuitive to say that simple guidelines lead to less noise. We like to think that the ability to take in and sort through complex variables makes our judgments better, but that's not always the case.
So we discussed in the criminal justice system how guidelines did reduce noise in sentencing. When an infant is born in the United States and many other countries, there's something called an APGAR score, where you rate a child, an infant, along 5 measures of health on a scale of 1 to 4, as I recall. And that APGAR score is a little like an algorithm, not a lot like an algorithm because there's judgment, but it is a real reducer of noise. If you ask people, is the kid healthy? They'd be very noisy. Under the APGAR score, not so much. So the basic idea is in many domains of life, medicine, law, engineering, fingerprinting, you move toward guidelines.
One controversial mechanism for moving these fields toward guidelines could be a greater reliance on machine learning and algorithms.
Algorithms in machine learning often are like an APGAR score. They're really, really rigid. So they might say, if the following ingredients of a patient show, then we predict it's more likely than not that they have the following disease, and no judgment at all. And that is by definition going to be a noise eliminator. Algorithms in machine learning are not noise. That's because they spit out the same answer every time.
When they're designed well, there is some evidence that AIs can be superior to humans. Another University of Chicago scholar, Senthil Mullainathan, created a study where an AI was trained to predict flight risk in bail decisions. The AI ended up performing much better than human judges. He also created an AI to diagnose the risk of heart attack in patients and the need for additional tests. Its accuracy was also superior to human doctors.
Now, they might be biased, or they might be ridiculous, or they might be otherwise objectionable, but the noise problem is eliminated. The fact is that in many domains, practitioners are finding algorithms are helpful as an aid. In medicine, for sure. And in some domains, they're finding that algorithms just outperform human beings. For flights, often judgments are made not by pilots, unless there are special circumstances, but the instruments tell you what to do.
In terms of this being one of the best solutions to the noise, do you feel that we'll start finding that the incidents of noise are going to cut back as AI starts taking a more prominent role in some of our decision making?
No question. So the reason the book isn't algorithms now, exclamation point, that's the title of the book, is first, we don't think it's realistic to say that algorithms will displace human judgment in every domain. And we don't think that's desirable for many reasons. But there's no question that we are moving toward increased reliance on algorithm and machine learning. And it's all TBD about whether they're improving things or not. We need to know, but they have great promise for doing exactly that. Now, how exactly to deal with that is a fair question. Do we want better algorithms? Is that the right solution? Or do we want the algorithm to be A, transparent, and B, merely advisory? So the judge can see, okay, this is what the algorithm says, but I actually know something it doesn't. I noticed in talking about the book something that is extremely interesting. That is, whenever I say something negative about algorithms, people tend to be really happy. If I say something positive about algorithms, people tend to be sad or mad. So there is a bias, I think, in favor of against algorithms, which outshoots the legitimate reasons for being nervous about algorithms.
If I am listening to this podcast, reading your book, and I think I buy the concept of noise, I want to do better. What can I personally do to minimize the impact that noise is having in my life?
Delay your intuition. So we often have an immediate intuition about something: job to take, house to buy, whom to marry, what puppy to get in the window. Don't ignore your intuition, but delay your intuition. After your initial intuition, kind of put it in a box and ask the various ingredients of the decision, the various components, assess each of them independently. There may be 7 in deciding, let's say, what job to take or whether to move. Look at each of the 7, assess them independently, make sure you have them maybe on a piece of paper, at least in your head, and then let your intuition go.
If you're getting a lot out of the important research shared on big brains, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories, not through opinions and anecdotes, but through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. If you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
Big Brains is a production of the UChicago Podcast Network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. The show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodap, with assistance from Alyssa Eads. Thanks for listening.